The Creator looked at the world and decided to destroy it. It is the most controversial and devastating event in human history. But why did it happen? Why was one family chosen to survive? And what is the ancient vow God made in the aftermath? A promise He has never broken, and the only reason we are still here today. Witness the true account of the flood, the destruction, the rescue, and the unbreakable covenant that changed everything. This is the story of the Great Flood. But to understand why the world was destroyed, we must first see the world as it was. Before the rain ever fell, there was another world, one where something had gone terribly wrong. The shadow fell across the valley floor before the man appeared. It was not the shadow of a cloud, nor of a mountain, but of a figure standing on the ridge, blocking the midday sun. Down in the settlement, the noise of iron striking stone ceased. Faces turned upward. They did not look with curiosity. They looked with a familiar, hollowed-out fear. The figure on the ridge took a step, and the ground seemed to shudder under the weight of an unnatural stride. He was one of the Nephilim, a hero of old, a man of renown, and his presence meant that whatever peace the village had scraped together was over. This was the world before the rain. A world where the boundaries between the earth and the heavens had grown thin and permeable. It was a time when the population of humanity exploded, spreading out across the face of the land, bringing with them a hunger that could not be sated. But the danger did not come initially from war or famine. It came from attraction. The sons of God, beings of a different order, looked down upon the daughters of humans. They saw beauty. They saw something to be possessed. They did not adhere to the separation that had been established at the foundation of the world. Therefore, they descended. They took wives, choosing whomever they pleased. There was no consent requested, only a taking. The result of this union was not a new era of peace, but a biological and spiritual anomaly. The offspring born to them were different. They grew tall, they grew strong. They became the mighty men who walked the earth with heavy feet, casting long shadows over the ordinary works of men. These were the Nephilim. But strength without a moral tether is a catastrophe. The earth began to change under their influence. It wasn't just that the Nephilim were physically imposing, it was that their existence signaled a total collapse of order. The wickedness of this human race deepened. It was not merely a series of bad actions or crimes, it was a fundamental shift in the architecture of the human mind. The inclination of the thoughts of the human heart became singular. Every plan, every desire, every silent imagination was evil. There were no intermittent moments of grace. There was no pause for altruism. The corruption was total. The earth was filled with violence. The strong consumed the weak. The supernatural offspring dominated the natural. Blood soaked into the soil, and the soil cried out, but there was no one on earth left to listen. But there was an observer. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become. He looked at the earth, and he saw a ruin. The intricate design, the breath of life, the careful separation of land and sea, all of it was marred by a corruption that rotted from the inside out. Therefore, the Lord was grieved. His heart was filled with pain. This was not the anger of a tyrant, but the sorrow of an artist whose masterpiece has been slashed. He regretted that he had made human beings on the earth. The verdict was delivered in silence, unseen by the violent crowds. The Lord said, "I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created." The decree was absolute. It included not just humanity, but the animals, the birds that flew in the poisoned air, and the creatures that moved along the ground. They were tied to the fate of man, and man had chosen death. Therefore, they would share in the erasure. But in this sweeping landscape of corruption, there was a single anomaly. One man stood apart. His name was Noah. He was not a warrior like the Nephilim. He was not a king. He was a man of the soil. But unlike the crowd surrounding him, Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was a righteous man. He was blameless among the people of his time. While others walked with the giants or walked with their own dark appetites, Noah walked faithfully with God. He had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They lived in the shadow of a violent empire, yet they remained distinct. But distinction is dangerous when the world demands conformity. The earth was corrupt in God's sight and full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. The diagnosis was terminal. There was no cure to be found in politics or philosophy. Therefore, the remedy had to be surgical. God spoke to Noah. The message was terrifying in its finality. I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. The sentence was death. But immediately following the sentence came a strange, precise instruction, a way of escape. So make yourself an ark. The material was specific: cypress wood. This was not a raft. It was a fortress against a coming chaos. It required rooms to be built inside. It required a coating of pitch, both inside and out, to seal it against the water that would soon overwhelm the world. The dimensions were given with architectural exactness. This was not a mythic vessel of magic. It was an engineering project of massive scale. The ark was to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. It was a box designed not to sail, but to survive. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door in the side of the ark and make lower, middle, and upper decks. The design was practical. It was heavy. It was real. Then came the reason. The looming threat that had been unspoken was finally given a name. I am going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens, every creature that has the breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish. The scope of the destruction was total. The mountains, the valleys, the cities of the violent men, the camps of the Nephilim, all would be submerged. But God established a covenant with Noah. This was a contract of survival. You will enter the ark, God said, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. The rescue was not just for humanity. It was a preservation of the created order. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. Birds of every kind, animals of every kind, creatures that move along the ground of every kind. They would come to Noah to be kept alive. The task was impossible for one man to coordinate. The logistics of gathering the animal kingdom were beyond human capability. Therefore, the animals would have to be drawn by an instinct they did not yet understand. And there was the matter of sustenance. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. Noah stood in the field. The sun was hot. The ground was dry. There was no rain. There was no ocean nearby. The command required him to dedicate his life, his resources, and his reputation to building a massive wooden structure in the middle of a violent, mocking world. Noah did everything just as God commanded him. He did not argue. He did not ask for a timeline. He picked up his tools. The construction began. The sound of axes biting into cypress wood replaced the silence of the mornings. The smell of pitch, thick and acrid, began to fill the air around Noah's home. Passers-by stopped. They watched. They saw a man building a ship where there was no water. They saw a man preparing for a disaster that the sky gave no hint of. The sun continued to rise and set. The seasons turned. The violence in the cities continued. The Nephilim continued their dominance, but Noah continued to build. He laid the keel. He raised the ribs of the hull. The structure began to rise, a dark wooden skeleton against the horizon. It was 3 stories tall, a monolith of obedience in a land of rebellion. His sons worked beside him. They carried the timber. They heated the pitch. They ignored the jeers of the neighbors who could not understand why anyone would prepare for a flood that had never happened. Years turned into decades. The ark grew. It became a landmark, a strange, silent testimony. It had no sails. It had no rudder. It was a coffin for the old world and a cradle for the new. Noah coated the wood with pitch. He sealed every crack. He made it watertight. He was sealing his family inside, and he was sealing the world out. The interior was honeycombed with rooms, stalls for the animals, granaries for the food. It was a floating ecosystem designed to sustain life in a void. The work was grueling. It was physical. It demanded everything Noah had, but he did not stop. He knew what was coming. He knew the violence that filled the earth could not last forever. He knew the silence of the heavens would eventually break. Then, the work was finished. The ark stood complete. A massive, dark box sitting on the dry earth. The waiting began. The sky remained clear. The sun remained bright. But then, the movement started. From the forests, from the deserts, from the mountains, they came. Not driven by men, but drawn by a silent command. 2 by 2. The birds darkened the sky as they circled and descended. The ground shook not with the steps of giants, but with the march of animals. They entered the ark. The impossible logistics resolved themselves. The creatures found their stalls. The noise of the world outside was replaced by the lowing of cattle and the rustling of wings inside the wooden cavern. Noah and his family stood at the threshold. They looked back at the world they were leaving. It was a world of cities and fields, of memories and histories. It was a world of people they knew, but it was a world that had chosen its fate. They entered the ark. Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives. 8 people, the remnant of mankind. Then, the final event of the preparation occurred. It was not an action of Noah. The door, the single entrance in the side of the massive vessel, began to move. It was too heavy for men to close alone. It was the final seal. The Lord shut him in. The heavy wood slammed into place. The light of the outside world was cut off. Inside it was dim, smelling of hay and pitch and animals. Outside the world was still. For a moment there was nothing, no rain, no thunder, just the silence of the shut door. But the atmospheric pressure began to drop. The air grew heavy. The birds outside stopped singing. The wind died down. Deep beneath the earth, the tectonic plates shifted. The ancient reservoirs of the deep, held in check for millennia, began to tremble. High above, the canopy of the sky, which had never known rain, began to darken. The clouds gathered, not white and fluffy, but black and bruised. The people outside looked up. They saw the darkness spreading. They felt the first drop. It was cold. It was real. The time for violence was over. The time for regret had passed. The door was shut, and the rain began to fall. It was not a gentle shower. It was the collapse of the sky. This was the end of the beginning. The world was about to be washed clean. Inside the ark, the wood creaked. The floor shifted. The voyage had begun. This is the moment history held its breath. It is the dividing line between the ancient world and the world we know. To understand this event is to understand that the earth beneath our feet is a graveyard of a previous civilization, buried not by time, but by catastrophe. It is the story of a total reset, where the only difference between life and extinction was a wooden door and the mercy of a pause. For 7 days, the ark sat on dry ground. The door was shut. The massive beams of cypress wood were sealed with pitch, creating a black, impenetrable barrier against the outside. Inside, the air was thick. The smell of animals, thousands of respirations in a confined space, began to rise. It was dark. The only light came from the ventilation opening high above, a narrow slit that offered no view of the ground, only a strip of the indifferent sky. Outside, the world continued. The sun rose. The sun set. The village down the valley likely continued its rhythm. The mockery that had surrounded the construction site for decades surely intensified. A massive boat, filled with animals, sitting in the dust. It was the definition of madness. But inside, there was a different reality. There was waiting. Noah and his family did not know the hour. They only knew the promise. The silence of those 7 days was heavier than the labor of the previous years. It was the silence of a held breath before a scream. Then, the timeline snapped. It was the 600th year of Noah's life. It was the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month. The date is recorded not as a legend, but as a legal entry, a timestamp on a death certificate. On that day, the stability of the terrestrial world collapsed. It did not begin with a cloud. It began from below. The narrative tells us that all the springs of the great deep burst forth. This was not a rainstorm. This was a geological insurrection. The crust of the earth, which had supported cities and forests for generations, suddenly fractured. The subterranean oceans, pressurized reservoirs trapped beneath the rock since the foundation of the world, found a release. Fissures tore open across the valley floors. Steam and superheated water blasted upward with the force of exploding volcanoes. The ground didn't just get wet, it broke. The foundations of the earth gave way, therefore the panic began instantly. Simultaneously, the atmosphere failed. The floodgates of the heavens were opened. The protective canopy that had regulated the climate, keeping the earth in a greenhouse stability, dissolved. The water that had been suspended above the firmament lost its suspension. It fell. This was not rain as we understand it. It was a collapse of the sky, a continuous, torrential sheet of water that did not stop for breath. It hammered the roof of the ark with a deafening roar. Inside, conversation became impossible. The sound of the water was a physical weight vibrating against the timber ribs of the ship. For 40 days and 40 nights, the assault continued. The mechanism of the flood was a pincer movement. Water from below rising to meet water from above. The earth was being returned to its primordial state. It was an act of uncreation. The separation between land and sea, established in the beginning, was being erased. Noah did not see this. He was sealed inside. He only felt it. At first, the ark did not move. It was massive, heavy with timber and cargo. The water pooled around its base. It turned the dry dust into mud. Then the mud turned into a swamp. Then the swamp became a lake. The water increased. It rose higher. It crept up the blackened sides of the hull. It reached the lower deck. It reached the middle deck. Then came the lurch. The physics of buoyancy took over. The massive structure, built on faith, broke its contact with the earth. It groaned as the timber flexed. The floor beneath Noah's feet shifted. The ark floated. It was lifted high above the earth. It was no longer a building. It was a vessel. It drifted on the surface of the chaos, unsteered, unguided, at the mercy of the currents. Inside, the sensation was disorienting. There was no horizon to fix the eye upon, just the rolling, pitching dark. Outside, the topography was disappearing. The water did not just fill the valleys, it pursued the high ground. The people of the time, the Nephilim, the kings, the ordinary families, they would have sought elevation. They climbed the hills, they scrambled up the ridges where they had once looked down on the ark. But the water was relentless. It wasn't a flash flood that receded after an hour. It was a steady, suffocating rise. It swallowed the tree lines. It swallowed the plateaus. The text is specific. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth. This implies a violence of turbulence. It wasn't a placid lake. It was a churning ocean of debris. Trees, structures, and bodies were swept into the currents. The ark moved on the face of the waters, a solitary speck in a churning gray hell. The tragedy of the flood is not in the water, but in the height. The waters rose until they covered all the high mountains under the entire heavens. Imagine the highest peak known to the people of that age. A place of safety, a place where the eagles nested, a place that felt untouchable. The water reached it, and it kept rising. It rose 15 cubits higher than the submerged mountains. Therefore, the result was absolute. Every living thing that moved on land perished. The list is exhaustive. Birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind. It is a chilling summary. The diverse, noisy, vibrant biological explosion that had filled the world was silenced. The birds that had filled the air were dragged down by wet wings. The cattle that had grazed the fields were swept away. The swarm of life, the insects, the reptiles, the small things vanished. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. The breath of life, that distinct spark given by the Creator. It was extinguished. The lungs filled with water. The heart stopped. The struggle ceased. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. Consider the psychology of the survivor. Noah acts as the captain of the only lifeboat in a global shipwreck. But he cannot see the shipwreck. He is blind to the devastation. He only knows that the world is gone because the sounds of the world have stopped. There is no more shouting, no more construction noise, no more bird song. There is only the sound of the rain. And then, eventually, the sound of the wind and the waves. The rain fell for 40 days, but the ordeal was far from over. The rain stopped, but the water did not leave. The narrative shifts from the violence of the storm to the terror of the duration. The waters flooded the earth for 150 days, 5 months. 5 months of drifting over a planet that has no shore. Inside the ark, the routine must have been grueling. Feeding the animals, cleaning the stalls, managing the food stores, living in the dark, damp, rocking wooden box. The smell would have been intense, the claustrophobia paralyzing. But deeper than the physical discomfort was the spiritual isolation. They were the only ones. The entire human race, reduced to 8 people. The weight of that knowledge is impossible to quantify. They were carrying the genetic future of humanity in a wooden capsule, floating over the corpse of the past. The ark was not designed to navigate. It had no sails to catch the wind, no rudder to steer against the current. This was intentional. Noah was not the pilot. He was the cargo. The path of the ark was determined solely by the movement of the water, which is to say, it was determined by the will of God. They drifted north, south. It didn't matter. There was no destination because there was no where anymore. Everywhere was the same. Deep, cold, boundless water. The irony of their situation was sharp. They were saved from the water, but they were imprisoned by it. They were safe, but they were buried. The ark was a tomb for the living, floating above the tomb of the dead. The text does not record the conversations between Shem, Ham, and Japheth during these months. But the tension must have been palpable. Every creak of the wood was a reminder of the thin barrier between them and oblivion. Every lurch of the ship was a reminder that they were not in control. Did they wonder if the water would ever recede? Did they wonder if God had forgotten them? The silence of God during the flood is as loud as the thunder. He spoke to command the building. He spoke to command the entry. Then he shut the door. And for 150 days, there is no record of his voice, just the water. This is the great trial of the ark. It is not just surviving the storm. It is surviving the waiting. It is trusting the architecture of the vessel when the architect has gone quiet. The waters prevailed. That is the word used. They prevailed. They won. They conquered the fortresses and the towers. They conquered the ambition of the Nephilim. They conquered the violence of the cities. The water was the great equalizer. It reduced the complex hierarchy of the antediluvian world to a flat, wet, monotone surface. The giants and the kings died the same death as the beggars. The gold and the iron were buried under the same mud. The slate was not just wiped clean, the slate was shattered. As the 150 days wore on, the conditions inside the ark would have shifted. The food stocks would be visibly diminishing. The animals would be sensing the passage of time. The humans would be marking the days on the walls of their wooden cave, wondering how much longer the timber could hold against the rot and the pressure. And yet, the ark held. The pitch held. The gopher wood held. The design was sound because the designer was perfect. We must understand the scale of this isolation. In our modern world, we can be rescued. We have satellites. We have communication. We have the hope that someone, somewhere, knows we are here. Noah had none of that. If the ark failed, there was no backup. If the water did not go down, there was no land to swim to. They were suspended in a void. This was a return to the chaotic waters of Genesis chapter 1, before the land appeared. The earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. Noah was floating in a deconstructed universe, but the story hangs on the tension of memory. The water was mighty, the destruction was total, the silence was absolute. But the narrative does not end in the drowning. It pivots on a single, invisible fact that would change the trajectory of the water and the fate of the 8 souls inside. The 150 days came to an end. The climax of the judgment had passed. The execution was complete. The world of violence was gone. Now, the question was, what comes next? The ark drifted on. The sky was likely still gray, the sun hidden behind the lingering bruising of the atmosphere. The water was still deep, covering the mountains, but something was about to shift. A change in the wind, a subtle alteration in the atmosphere. The God who shut the door had not walked away. The script ends here, suspended on the surface of the infinite ocean, waiting for the first sign that the nightmare is ending, waiting for the wind. But God remembered Noah. The turning point of history was not an explosion, but a thought. God remembered Noah. He remembered the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. In the midst of a silent, drowned planet, the focus of the divine returned to the solitary wooden box drifting on the surface of the deep. Therefore, the physics of the world began to reverse. God sent a wind over the earth. It was not a destructive gale, but a drying force. It swept across the endless ocean, churning the surface, pushing against the stagnant humidity. The waters began to recede. Deep beneath the surface, the springs of the deep were stopped. The fractured crust of the earth sealed itself. Above, the floodgates of the heavens were closed. The rain, which had ceased its torrential violence, was now forbidden from falling even as mist. The assault was over. The reclamation began. The water receded steadily from the earth. It was not a sudden drain, but a slow, agonizing withdrawal. Day by day, the level dropped. The ocean, which had conquered the mountains, began to surrender its territory. At the end of the 150 days, the water had gone down. Then came the impact. It was the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month. The ark, which had known only the fluid motion of the waves for half a year, suddenly shuddered. A grinding, tearing sound echoed through the timber hull. The floor, which had tilted and swayed, became rigid. The motion stopped. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. It was not a soft landing. It was a collision with the re-emerging world. The vessel was grounded high in a range of jagged peaks surrounded by a receding sea. Inside, the sensation must have been terrifying. The safety of the drift was gone. They were now fixed in place, but they were still blind. They could not see where they were. They only knew that the world beneath them was solid again. But the waiting continued. The waters continued to recede until the 10th month. It was a slow reveal. The ocean was stripping itself away, layer by layer. On the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains became visible. Imagine the view from the narrow ventilation window. For months, there had been nothing but gray water and gray sky. Now, dark shapes broke the surface, islands of rock rising from the deep. The skeleton of the earth was showing through. 40 days passed. The patience required was excruciating. Noah, the captain of this stationary ship, needed data. He needed to know if the atmosphere was breathable, if the land was habitable, if the death had truly passed. He opened the window he had made in the ark. He sent out a raven. The black bird shot out into the cool air. It was a scavenger, a creature designed to survive on the margins. It kept flying back and forth until the water had dried up from the earth. It found no place to land, perhaps, or perhaps it found floating debris, the refuse of the dead world, and was content. It did not return to stay. It was a symbol of the wild, untamable nature of the new world. Then, Noah sent out a dove. He needed a different kind of answer. He wanted to see if the water had receded from the surface of the ground. The dove was delicate. It required a clean place to rest its foot, but the dove found no resting place. The world was still a swamp. The peaks were bare rock, wet and inhospitable. The valleys were still submerged. She returned to him in the ark. Noah reached out his hand and took the bird and brought her back to himself in the ark. It was a moment of tenderness in a brutal narrative. The world was not yet ready to receive gentleness. He waited 7 more days. The passage of time in the ark was measured in these intervals of hope and disappointment. 7 days of staring at the wood. 7 days of listening to the wind. Again, he sent the dove out from the ark. This time, the wait was different. The day passed. The sun began to lower. When the dove returned to him in the evening, there was something in its beak, a freshly plucked olive leaf. It was a small green fragment of life. It meant that somewhere, down the slopes of the Ararat Range, the trees were not just emerging, they were alive. Photosynthesis had resumed. The cycle of growth had restarted. Then Noah knew that the water had receded from the earth. He waited 7 more days and sent the dove out again. This time, she did not return to him. She had found a home. The world was wide enough for her now. The cage was no longer necessary, but Noah did not leave. He was disciplined. He had entered by command, and he would only leave by command. By the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, the water had dried up from the earth. Noah then removed the covering from the ark. He looked out. The roof was pulled back, and the full light of the sun hit the interior for the first time in a year. He saw the surface of the ground was dry. The mud had hardened. The sheen of the water was gone. But still, he waited. The ground was dry, but the command had not come. By the 27th day of the second month, the earth was completely dry. Then God spoke to Noah. The silence broke. The voice that had sealed the door now opened the world. "Come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives with you. Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you, the birds, the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, so they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number on it." The release was absolute. The quarantine was over. So Noah came out. He stepped onto the rocky soil of Ararat. His legs, used to the shifting deck, had to adjust to the solidity of the mountain. His family followed him. Then came the exodus of the animals. It was a chaotic, noisy parade. The heavy beasts, the flighty birds, the crawling things, they poured out of the wooden womb of the ark. They scrambled down the mountainside, dispersing into the empty, silent world. They were the seeds of a new creation, scattering into the wind. The ark stood empty. Its purpose was fulfilled. It was a shell left on the mountain as a monument to the judgment. Noah stood in the new world. It was clean. It was silent. There were no cities. There were no kings. There were no Nephilim. The violence was gone. But so was the history. He was standing on a blank page. His first act was not to build a house. It was not to plant a field. Noah built an altar to the Lord. He took some of all the clean animals and clean birds, creatures he had spent a year protecting and feeding, and he sacrificed them on the altar. It seems counterintuitive to kill the survivors. But it was an act of profound recognition. Noah understood that his survival was not due to his carpentry or his cleverness. It was a gift. The smoke of the burnt offerings rose into the clear, washed air. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, and in that moment, the relationship between God and humanity was reset. The heart of God, which had been filled with pain at the violence of the old world, now moved toward mercy. The Lord said in his heart, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures, as I have done." It was a stark admission. The flood had washed the earth, but it had not washed the human heart. The inclination to evil remained. The virus survived in the blood of the 8 survivors, but the response of God changed. Instead of total erasure, there would be preservation. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. Then God blessed Noah and his sons. He gave them a mandate, echoing the first mandate given to Adam: "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth." But the rules had changed. The harmony of Eden was gone. "The fear and dread of you will be upon all the beasts of the earth," God said, "upon all the birds of the sky, upon every creature that moves along the ground, and upon all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hands." Imagine the immediate consequence of these words. The animals, which had just spent a year living in the close proximity of the ark, dependent on Noah for their food, suddenly felt a shift in their instinct. The lion, which had accepted the fodder, now looked at the man and felt a primal warning. The deer, which had stood calmly in the stall, now twitched with the urge to run. The truce of the ark was over. The wild had returned. And with this separation came a fundamental alteration in the sustenance of mankind. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. For 1,600 years, the narrative suggests a vegetarian existence. Now, the menu included flesh. This was a concession to the harshness of the post-flood environment, or perhaps an acknowledgement of the harder nature of man. To survive, life would now require the consumption of life. But there was a restriction, a line that could not be crossed. "But you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it." The blood was sacred. It was the currency of existence. It belonged to the Creator, not the consumer. This prohibition was the first hint of a new legal code, a way to maintain reverence in a world that was becoming increasingly bloody. Then, God escalated the law. He moved from the blood of beasts to the blood of men. "And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal. And from each human being too, I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being." This was the establishment of justice. In the world before the flood, Lamech had boasted of killing a man for wounding him. Violence was a badge of honor. It was unchecked. Now, God established a terrifying symmetry. "Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind." This was the cornerstone of civilization. The value of a human life was not determined by strength or status or wealth. It was determined by the imago Dei, the image of God. To destroy a human was to attack the image of the Creator. Therefore, the forfeit was total. Noah and his sons stood under the open sky, listening to the constitution of the new nations. They were no longer just survivors. They were magistrates. They were carrying the sword of justice into the empty lands. But laws and mandates do not heal trauma. The 8 people on that mountain carried a deep psychological wound. They had seen the sky turn black. They had seen the water rise. They had heard the world die. Every time a cloud gathered over Ararat, every time the wind picked up, every time a drop of rain fell on their skin, the panic must have been paralyzing. Is it happening again? The PTSD of the flood would have been a generational haunting. The fear that God was volatile, that the destruction could return at any moment, would make it impossible to build, to plant, or to dream. God knew this. He knew that humanity could not thrive if it was constantly looking at the sky in terror. Therefore, he offered a contract. "I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you," God said. This was not a conditional agreement. It wasn't, "If you are good, "I won't drown you," it was unilateral. It was a promise made by the stronger to the weaker. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. But words are invisible. A traumatized mind needs something to see. It needs an anchor for the eye. So God signed the contract with light. "I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth." Imagine the visual, the storm clouds, dark and bruised, retreating toward the horizon, the sun breaking through from the opposite side, the light hitting the moisture in the air, the very substance that had caused the death, and refracting. A bow appeared. In the ancient world, the bow was a weapon of war. It was an instrument of death. But this bow was different. It was not directed at the earth. It was hung in the clouds, unstrung. It was a warrior hanging up his weapon. It was a symbol of peace painted in the impossible colors of the spectrum. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant. It was a reassurance that the chaotic forces of nature were leashed. The water would never again win. The cycle of destruction was closed. Noah looked up. He saw the arc of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. It was the first thing of pure beauty in the new world. It was the bridge over the abyss. With the covenant secured, the narrative shifts. The camera moves from the cosmic to the domestic, from the mountaintop to the valley floor. The years began to pass. The family descended from the heights. They found a place where the soil was deep and rich, fed by the silt of the deluge. They began the hard work of restarting civilization. Noah was no longer the shipbuilder. He was no longer the animal keeper. The text gives him a new title. Noah, a man of the soil. He returned to the earth. He dug his hands into the ground that had been cursed and then washed. He was a farmer. And like all farmers, he wanted to cultivate something that offered more than just survival. He wanted comfort. He planted a vineyard. Vines take time. You cannot plant a vineyard today and drink wine tomorrow. It takes years for the roots to take hold, for the vines to mature, for the grapes to swell with sugar. This means that what happens next did not happen immediately after the flood. It happened years later, perhaps a decade or more. Noah was aging. The burden of being the second Adam was immense. He was the only man alive who remembered the old world. He remembered the songs, the cities, the faces of the friends who had mocked him and then drowned. He carried the library of human history in his own memory. That is a heavy load for one man. The harvest came. The grapes were crushed, the juice fermented. Noah drank some of the wine. It was warm, it was sweet, and it did what wine is designed to do. It softened the edges of reality. It blurred the sharp lines of memory. But Noah did not just drink. He became drunk. The hero of the flood, the man who walked with God, the survivor of the apocalypse, settled down. He grew grapes. He made wine. And he drank the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered inside his tent. It is a jarring image. The man who stood upright when the whole world was crooked now lies collapsed in a stupor. The stress of the year, the trauma of the survival, the burden of the memory. Perhaps it was too much. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his two brothers outside. It was a moment of vulnerability exploited, a breach of honor. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked in backward and covered their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned the other way so that they would not see their father naked. They protected his dignity when he could not protect it himself. When Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, the curse returned. Not a curse on the ground, but a curse on a family line. Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. The new world began with a fracture. The unity of the ark was broken by a tent flap and a bottle of wine. Then Noah turned to the other two. Praise be to the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. Shem would be the carrier of the spiritual blessing. From his line would come the patriarchs, the prophets, and eventually, the Messiah. He was the keeper of the name. May God extend Japheth's territory. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be the slave of Japheth. Japheth would be the expander, the nations of the coastlands, the spreaders of culture and civilization, but they would find their spiritual home in the tents of Shem. The prophecy was mapped out. The three branches of the human family were defined not by their biology, but by their character in the face of their father's shame. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. He lived to see the snow settle permanently on the peaks of Ararat. He lived to see his grandchildren and great-grandchildren populate the valleys. He lived to see the fear of the animals become a permanent reality. He lived to see the rainbow arc across the sky 1,000 times, each time a silent nod from the Creator that the water would stay in its place. But he also lived to see the shadow of Babel rising. He lived to see that while the earth was new, the heart was old. The flood had cleansed the soil, but it had not cleansed the soul. Noah lived a total of 950 years, and then he died. The link to the world before the rain was severed. The man who had touched the gopher wood and heard the voice of God in the silence was gone. He was buried in the earth he had saved. This brings us to the conclusion of the Genesis flood narrative. It is a story that begins with grief and ends with a grave. It travels from a crowded, violent world through a watery decreation and into a quiet, empty mourning. It features a God who grieves, a man who builds, and a covenant that endures. But as the screen fades to black on the life of Noah, we are left with a complex legacy. We have the rainbow, a sign of mercy hanging in the chaos. It tells us that the universe is not random, that there is a restraint upon the destruction. But we also have the vineyard, the reminder that salvation from the storm does not equal salvation from oneself. Noah could build a boat to survive the wrath of God, but he could not build a defense against his own weakness. The flood waters had receded, but the human problem remained. The stage was set for a new kind of intervention. If water could not wash away the sin of the world, then something else, something far more costly than rain, would eventually be required. The sons of Noah turned away from the grave and looked toward the horizon. The plain of Shinar lay to the east. The urge to build a name for themselves was stirring in their blood. The cycle was beginning again. The silence was the loudest thing on earth. For a year, the ears of the 8 survivors had been filled with the groaning of timber, the drumming of rain, and the restless noise of 1,000 animals confined in the dark. Now, they stood on the rocky slopes of the mountains of Ararat, and the silence stretched out in every direction, wrapping around the curvature of the world. There were no birds calling in the distance. They were all right here, fluttering nervously near the ark, afraid to disperse. There was no wind rustling through forests, for the forests were gone, stripped away to the bedrock or buried under layers of rapidly drying silt. There was no hum of distant cities, no sound of metal on stone, no laughter, no weeping. The world had been reset to zero. Noah stood at the center of this void. He was 601 years old. He was the oldest human being on the planet, the patriarch of a species that had been pruned down to a single family tree. He looked at his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They were blinking in the sunlight, their skin pale from the long confinement, their muscles atrophied from the cramped quarters. They looked out at a horizon that was empty. They were safe. The wood had held, the pitch had sealed. But as they looked at the mud-caked valleys below, a terrifying realization must have settled in. They were alone. The absolute isolation of their position was a weight heavier than the water. They were the inheritors of a graveyard. Every step they took away from the ark was a step onto soil that was composed of the debris of the past. The previous world, the world of their neighbors, their extended families, the tyrants and the giants, was now just the sediment beneath their feet. Therefore, the first emotion of the new world was not joy. It was awe, and perhaps a shivering kind of dread. How does humanity begin again when the memory of the end is so fresh? God spoke. He broke the silence of the mountains to address the survivors. But the words he spoke were not merely a repetition of the original mandate given to Adam in the garden. The world had changed, and therefore the rules of engagement had to change. Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. The command was familiar. It was the engine of biological expansion, but then came the shift. In the garden, there had been a harmony between man and beast, a naming, a stewardship, but violence had entered the world, and the flood had not washed away the capacity for violence. It had only washed away the perpetrators. The nature of reality had hardened. The fear and dread of you will be upon all the beasts of the earth, God declared. Upon all the birds of the sky, upon every creature that moves along the ground, and upon all the fish of the sea, they are given into your hands.